What was the East? Oh my God. That's a good question. What was the East? It was a cultural community of individuals who wanted institutions and businesses run by, founded by, taught by Black people. It was history in the making. It was a mecca. It was home, and it was a revolution. One of our mantras was, what time is it? It's nation time.
There was an energy about the East that brought together the artists and the willingness of the people to just have this experience, this joint experience.
For me, I could say I was almost born again as a Black man at the East.
It was the place to be. One of the coolest, most happening, most fun, and most beloved spots in all of Brooklyn. And as far as I'm concerned, in all of Manhattan, in all of New York City.
When the East began, it began with the school. And that school was the Uhuru Sasa Shule, Kiswahili for Freedom Now School. And the name itself announces the urgency of the moment, freedom now.
When Brown versus the Board of Education case went through the Supreme Court, the decision was that schools had to be desegregated. And New York City, to this day, actually, has some of the most segregated schools in the country. There was a huge demonstration led by Bayard Rustin and a minister from Brooklyn's Shiloh Presbyterian Church named Milton Galveston. And they organized a boycott in 1964 to protest the fact that segregation was still so prevalent. And in fact, this was the largest civil rights demonstration in the United States. Nobody ever talks about this particular Freedom Day that happened in New York City. Black people realized they could be loud and they could demand things, and they weren't going to sit there and wait until the establishment got around to them. They did as little as possible in the 60s to integrate schools, but when they had to, they went to busing as the way of desegregating schools. And they would grab the kids from the poor neighborhoods like Brownsville and the rest of Bed-Stuy and send them off to neighborhoods like Bay Ridge and Canarsie and other predominantly white neighborhoods that were unfortunately not particularly thrilled with having this happen.
But what we saw is that it was a deeply flawed experiment, because not only when Black people got to white schools were they still being segregated and still being sort of shunted to the side and still not having full access to quality education. For all the Black children and educators and institutions and even buildings themselves that were sort of left behind, it was always understood that they were inferior. And in many ways, they were left to wither on the vine and to deteriorate.
I grew up in Bed-Stuy. So the schools that I went to were, I guess now you would say they were the forgotten schools. And there was a way of treating the Black children in those schools as if they were not fully human. At least that's how I felt as a student. I never connected with my teachers, and I didn't feel like they connected with me. They came there to do a job and to get paid for it.
So by the time you've seen busing attempts to integrate schools and really institutionalize this notion that Black people can only receive a quality education if they're rubbing up against white people, this realization that that's not working for us. And that the only way we're going to have any kind of possibility of a quality education is if we build our own schools, if we build our own institutions. You know, in the late 60s, the Ford Foundation decided to fund an experiment in community control. This idea that school districts can be given some level of decision-making, self-governing ability, hire their own teachers, create their own curriculum, manage their own institutions.
This plan, however, was an experiment, and part of that experiment was in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville community. Ocean Hill borders the Bedford-Stuyvesant area. Rhodey McCoy, who was put in charge as the union administrator, really began to try to find out ways to put more control in terms of curriculum, hiring of teachers, and most importantly, having the community find itself in a position where it could determine the content and the quality of schooling for its student population and for the parents that were involved.
The new Brownsville board, and they emphasized Black history and Black culture in addition to all the regular stuff that they were teaching. One school that had a large Puerto Rican population, they went totally bilingual. Many of the community people thought this was great, but the unions thought it was union busting.
Jitu Weusi was a teacher during the experiment in community control, specifically in 271 in Ocean Hill, Brownsville.
Well, I was a young teacher in the 1960s, having entered the school system in 1962. And myself and people like Albert Vann and Dorothy Joseph and Marsha Goldman, Audrey Williams, we were all new teachers, and we began to notice a lot of injustices in the school system internally from the point of view of teachers. Well, I felt I was part of the freedom struggle of Black people. I was part of the ongoing struggle of the Black community to establish itself, to obtain self-determination, to obtain dignity, and to obtain liberation. Eventually, this type of thinking led us to come together as a group, which was the African American Teachers Association. We teachers began to hear the voices and demands of students for the need for change. And these students were brought together to form the African American Students Association. But when I came into junior high school 271 in March, I found conditions only can be described as incredulous. There was no teaching going on. The teaching had just stopped. Teachers came in the morning with radios, with coffee and cake and newspapers. Teachers left their classrooms to place their bets at the track. The teaching process within that school had been suspended. It was my belief that there was a calculated effort on the part of the union teachers, the United Federation of Teachers, members, supporters, to sabotage the experimental program.
So the teachers union really objected to being left out of everything.
I think that folks realized early on that feeding Black power is a very scary thing, particularly to white people, but also to other Black people who haven't fully embraced the idea of Black power. And you had the exertion of community control in the form of administrators saying, you know what? We don't believe that many of these teachers in our schools are really about Black liberation. And so we're going to have to make some changes, and we're going to have to fire them. And this particularly went against the sense of power among the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers in New York, and the fact that this idea that you can't just fire someone summarily, they've got to go through a process, you got to do your due diligence.
And so this ended up being a huge strike where in the September of 68, 93% of the city's teachers walked out.
And specifically, what happened was the UFT went back to what was tried and true. It wasn't enough to say that this district should not be allowed to fire teachers. What it then said was, these are Black people with a radical agenda, and not only do they have a radical agenda against white people, they have a radical agenda against Jewish people. And so not only did they stoke the flames of white supremacy, but they also really tried to cultivate this idea of anti-Semitism.
I don't believe that anti-Jewish feeling was any part of what was happening in Ocean Hill-Brownsville. Many of the persons who supported Ocean Hill-Brownsville were Jews. There were Jews within McCoy's administration. There were Jews working in the schools. There were Jews who were consultants to the district. In other words, there was no issue of Jewish anti-Semitism or Jewish work in the district that came up. That was not a question. What anti-Semitism was, it was a means for the teachers' union to deflect criticism of their role from them to the community by using this question of anti-Semitism.
Which is not to say that there were not streams of anti-Semitism there. There indeed were. But the people who came together around community control, that was the furthest things from their mind, right? They were not thinking about, oh, how can we get rid of the Jewish teachers? They were like, how can we educate our children in a way that was truly empowering? And that has to be done in a way where if you are standing in front of a classroom, then you have to be dedicated to this idea of Black liberation.
The strike ended in November because the state had to take control of the system and come in and restore order. They brought all the teachers that were fired back, and in the aftermath, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school system lost the community control.
That really brought into clear focus who really had the power in New York City. And the power, therefore, rested in the UFT, United Federated Teachers. And that's why individuals like Jitu Weusi, Al Van, both members of the African American Teachers Association, thought that there had to be an alternative or a different way to address the schooling needs of students of African ancestry outside of the public school system. And it's the synergy between the African American Teachers Association and the African American Student Association that would lead ultimately to the East organization that was founded in the fall of 1969.
Well, in September of '68, a number of us at IS 271, Junior High School 271, decided to start an evening school to provide classes and instruction for the youth and adults of the community. This was just an idea that we had, and it became a tremendous success. We had dance classes where 30 and 40 women would come in to participate. We had Black history classes where we had 25, 30 people taking Black history class. We had sewing classes and other classes that the community at that time identified that they would like to have. So this told us that if we could do this and it could be successful, that we could in fact develop our own types of schools. So 2 years later, after Ocean Hill was over, this is exactly what we did.
The Teachers Association had their office at Clausen and Fulton Street. And as we began to grow, we were kind of cramped in space. The Teachers Association, and there we were as students, and you can imagine 10 students up in the space with teachers, and so it was like, y'all gotta get your own space. But God is so good, because the space showed up right around the corner as 10 Claver Place.
In this period of the fusion between young people, that is high schoolers, and young adults who were teaching, the average age of each member was probably in the low to mid-20s. Many of the high schoolers were probably 17 and 18 when they joined the East.
You know, one of the biggest things we had in a small little room was what to call the damn institution. We went off about 3 hours trying to figure out the name. I still push for Kush, K-U-S-H. That was my thing. That's what I was going for. But I think, Jitu won out by strength of force because he felt that East represented much more of what we were all about.
The East name is really significant. It's also this idea that the East being opposition to the West, right? And so the base premise of the East was that in order to find this elusive thing called freedom or liberation, that peoples of African ancestry had to engage in an intentional process of not only moving away from things quote-unquote Western, and to begin to build what they called new African women and men for this moment.
The plan for the utilization of Tanclaver Place was to have our own space, an institution where we could now conduct our own classes, as well as beginning to have performances.
So from the school came the Black Experience in Sound, which were the jazz sessions and the poetry sessions on the weekends with people like Farrah Sanders, Sun Ra, Rashawn Roland Kirk, Dewey Redmond, and a host of others.
At the heart of the East was this recognition that culture really was at the foundation of throwing off the yoke of white supremacy. And so it became a full 360-degree cultural arts and music movement.
And the idea that we could bring the greatest musicians in the world to the East and that they would perform in Bedford-Stuyvesant right here was something that was unique.
Well, I was working on Wall Street, my first job, 18 years old, got out of high school, and I never hated anything so much as that job on Wall Street. But the cool thing about it was there's a lot of young Black people who had been recruited to come down to Wall Street and, I guess, diversify the place. So there was a lot of conversations about what was happening, what was cool, what was going on. And I lived in Brooklyn, and everybody was talking about the East, the East, the East. So every weekend I was there for the music. And then Brother Jitu, and I guess some of the other folks must have saw me just coming there, sitting in the back, real quiet. And they were like, "Sister, do you want to, we need help in the kitchen." And I was like, great, I could help in the kitchen. I wasn't working on the weekend. And that way they said, you get to come for free. You don't have to pay anymore. So nothing could have been better for me. So I just started waiting tables.
Well, first of all, the audience participated, on time, in time, right? So people, after a while, began to bring maracas and shekarays and, just stuff, bells, stuff to make music with. People, came ready to make music in their own way. All of that contributed to musicians loving the space. They just love the hominess of it because, there are not too many places where you can go and hear this music where Black folks are in charge, especially back then.
There was one lady, Miss Lottie, Mama Lottie, never forget her. She lived on G2's block. She was a hell of a cook, wore her wig, smoked her cigarettes day in and day out, and all of that stuff. And guess what? She came in to run our kitchen.
So there was no smoking, drinking at the East. One of the things that the East became famous for was the menu. We had dishes like kawaii rice, a vegetarian rice that we did. We were famous for the punch.
I was awash in the music. I got to experience all that music every weekend. And it was like gold and jewels. It was so rich to me. That experience will last a lifetime. And at the time, I think I was 19 or 20. So I didn't ask questions. Jitu was this big, giant, brilliant leader who, like anything he said, we all were like, yes, Jitu, what would you like us to do now? So when he came to me and said, we're going to start a school, and I think that I think you can do it. And I, of course, said, absolutely not. I never taught. I don't know anything about teaching. My major was political science, and I was planning to become a lawyer. And he's like, there's something natural about you. I know you can do it. So I trusted him. And I also wanted the school to succeed. We were encouraged to think as big and broadly as we could about how to bring the African diaspora into our classroom.
The subject matter that we were taught was based in the experiences of African peoples. When we talk about science, the broad range of arithmetic and other things, one of the first things we were taught was that the first scientists, the first mathematicians were people who looked like us, were people who built amazing things.
We learned about African history as well as Black history. That history was ingrained in us. We were taught that our Blackness was beautiful.
We are the original Wakanda children. Like in Wakanda, when they're like, Wakanda forever, right? We used to march around, like line up, and they would be like, Angalia, NJ. And we have pictures like that, school pictures where we're like, so cute.
Many children who go to public school pledge their allegiance to the United States of America. We had a different pledge. We pledged ourselves to contributing to the Black liberation movement, to our freedom. And so that meant that whatever we did was a part of this process of trying to make sure we were every day putting something in the pot of changing the material conditions of our people. And so it was not out of the ordinary for us as part of our regular school day to go down to Wall Street and participate in the anti-apartheid divestment march. We participated in protests around the death of the killing of Arthur Miller, around the killing of Luis Baez, both at the hands of the NYPD.
Whenever there was, something that happened, a shooting or, some injustice that was done, we were on the front lines and we were marching. And I'm not sure that at the young age, we fully understood, the value in that, but we were out there for the community to see us and to see our activism, to, embrace and join in many cases.
I had dance classes, and actually that's where I started dancing. We were taught that if you waste any gift, you were insulting your ancestors. And it was just like, what? You know how to write, but you're not writing poetry. You're not writing essays. You know how to sing, but you're not using your voice. You know how to move, but you're not dancing. That was a true insult. And so they pushed us to just be. Whatever you felt like doing, they allowed you to do it in whatever genre you wanted to do it.
How old was I when I joined the East? I was born into the East, so my weekend activities, my social sort of life was not one that had a bunch of basketball games, going on trips to the park or anything like that. It was me by my father's side in meetings, doing planning, helping him coordinate and set up for different things. And that was how I spent, my time. And that wasn't just me. Many of the other children did that as well. We would have people who were from South Africa who were exiles living with us. I woke up one morning and we had Nina Simone living with us for a weekend. So it was a whole life, it was a whole world. And, we sort of lived in this little bubble that was something that defined who we were.
There was so many going on between 1969 and 1973. You might call it an explosion of about 25 to 30 institutions or enterprises that essentially wrapped itself around Uhuru Sasa and led to the outgrowth of the East into this multi-pronged, complex institution.
When you think about the fact that Central Brooklyn is the largest urban concentration of Black people in the United States, I think it was just inevitable.
Nation building, of course, has to be built on institutions.
Sweet East Restaurant.
East Kitchen and Caterers.
Black News newspaper. The Black News came out on a monthly schedule, pretty much. Wherever Black people were, and we could receive information on their struggle and their sacrifices and their achievements, we covered it.
Out of Black News, which was the news magazine, there became a publishing company called East Publishers.
East Records. Imani Child Development Center.
We had a bookstore.
The bookstore was called Akiba and Cool.
Mavazi clothing shop.
The East had a clothing store where they would actually import or they would create their own clothing based upon latest styles within the African world.
Evening School of Knowledge.
Kanunawana Food Cooperative.
Then we had our food store. We opened up a store that provided both herbs and fresh vegetables.
East Jazz Club.
Uhuru Sasa Shule.
Wherever you have large concentrations of Black people, you find this desire, this effort to really take advantage of that critical mass.
But here we had numbers. This was the largest Black community in terms of concentrated population outside of Nigeria and Brazil.
As you can imagine, all these institutions that were founded by the East between 1969 and 1973 took a lot of work and energy.
To keep people motivated in doing the work in nation building, we say Kazi is the blackest of all, and Kazi means work in Swahili.
Because during that time, people would try to outdo your Blackness by how many different African languages they could speak, how many dashikis. And the East was like, if you ain't putting in no work, all of that don't mean nothing. Like, the work, your contributions is the way we measure your Blackness.
And so the work was 24 hours. This was the excitement, but also the exhaustion, of those initial few years of building out the East Complex.
I was 21 when I came to the East. I had been a student activist. I had been part of the takeover at CCNY in April of 1969. The East was filled with youthful exuberance. All the young people, basically very, very gung-ho. They were really the forerunning foot soldiers of the organization.
We went one step further, though. I'll never forget, I'm walking down Claver Place with Jitu, and he actually said, listen, man, we thinking about trying to send some people to Guyana because the government has given us 300 acres of land that we can use any way we want to. And so we need some folk to go down and begin the process of pioneering and using that land to then send those products back to our store in Brooklyn. So my family and I, we ended up in Guyana for 2 years.
Why go all the way to South America? The East firmly believed in the actuality of Pan-African solidarity, meaning that we needed to make sure that we establish in a very meaningful way relationships with other nations who were committed to some of the same things and values, and making sure that those relationships were based on mutual development and growth. And being in Guyana at that time was an opportunity to do that.
Yes, I went. Large contingent of the East Sisterhood went. Then we got off those small planes and got in buses and lorries, trucks, and went all day into the bush. And the goal was to physically clear that space, that jungle, and to do a road.
As an adult now, I can look back on it and say, that was a great experience. As a child, I complained the entire time I was there because we were uprooted from central Brooklyn and then went way out into the bush of Guyana where we had no electricity, no running water, and we had to go to school and farm. That was, if you could imagine, a huge culture shift. We weren't prepared for that. But we made it happen. And that experience really taught us a lot in terms of how we actually can put our principles into practice and make these ideas of solidarity something that is not just verbally expressed, but there are meaningful ways of expressing solidarity.
The International African Arts Festival. I remember when that started in the very beginning of Uhuru Sasa School, and it was right there on Claver Place. Back then we called it the African Street Carnival, but then it eventually progressed so much that it became the International African Arts Festival. And it was a fundraiser for the school.
because parents only paid, I think in the early days, maybe $10 a month. And so there wasn't a lot of funds at the end of the year. And so parents, along with Jitu, came up with the idea of doing this festival. You have artists, of course, of all walks of life, musicians, poets, media artists, but it's also, we have discussions. We have a symposium that goes on with the festival.
This street festival is really the international exposition of Afrocentricity and African people at its best. And many people go away on this weekend. I come home on this weekend because this is Harambe. This is when we all get together in central Brooklyn and show blackness at its best right here where we live.
This is my third year, and it's always exciting to be here. One of the most exciting things about being here is the feeling of peace, Jamak Jam. And what it really means is that there can be no peace unless we're all fortified.
Going to the African Street Festival as a kid was my fondest memories. First of all of our parents were working the booths, working the tables, working the first aid, putting up the stage. I remember, I think being 8 years old. Nobody had a chaperone. We just all ran around. It was children everywhere. It was safe. Nobody was being snatched. You know, if mama so-and-so looked at you and you were doing something wrong, or you even looked like you want to do something wrong, you know, they were just like, where you going? What you doing? Your mama know where you are? But it didn't matter because you were my mama and you know where I am.
This became something that even now, as my children grow older, they will refer to the people who taught them, the adults who actually interacted with them as mama and baba, mother and father, because that is the nature of the kind of relationships that we attempted to try to create.
The basic human institution is the family. And that's why the East was an extended family. That was the beginning of everything. The first principle of the Nguzo Saba is umoja, unity, to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, and race.
And we're rocking in the Jitu Weusi Plaza. The way it's supposed to be.
I was there. I can testify. This is genuine. This is a real brother. He was a teacher extraordinaire. He was an organizer beyond any other. And in that big body, there was a big heart. Big heart, love for his beloved community, love for Black people. Oh, how Jitu loved Black people.
People would be given these assignments by Jitu.
Always thinking, cerebral, always having a vision, being a visionary, seeing things that other people couldn't necessarily see, and then convincing people that they needed to go and come along with him on this particular journey that would take you and him in some directions that previously you and he had not moved.
And sometimes you had assignments where you might sink or swim.
I love Jitu. From the time I met him until he passed away, he was a hero. He was a giant in more ways than one. Yeah. And what he saw in me and what he saw in everyone was potential. So when he saw me, he was like, I see potential in you, sister. And the next thing you know, I was like the teacher.
Jitu decided that I was going to get the assignment to go ahead and do this radio program. So he asked me, and I said, Jitu, what are you talking about radio? I don't know anything about radio. Well, he said, brother, this is your assignment. So I said, okay. I started out, and I guess at a particular point, I got, pretty good at it. on the radio now. We're filming this on radio station WBAI, where I have a program called Education at the Crossroads, which is now in its 25th year.
I was actually born into the East. My father is Jitu Weusi. He was born Les Campbell. He met my mother at the East. I mean, there's so many titles that I saw him as. But ultimately, I think for me, he was my guide. In his later years, he was my best friend. We traveled together, him and I. And I really got to know him as a person, besides all these other titles that I'm constantly reminded of.
I would like to take a minute. I think it's very important to give thanks where thanks is deserved. I told you earlier that Brother Jitu Weusi was the brainchild behind this whole African Street Festival. And I used to go out there and watch him on Claver Place just work that one street, and it has evolved to this. I put my nephew in his school, Uhuru Sasa, and I saw immediate results. I would like to bring him on stage at this time to say a few words to you. Please, Brother Jitu Weusi.
Mari has done such a great job. Let's give her a hand. Let's give Mari a hand. She has done a fantastic job, and she looks beautiful. Doesn't she look great? Doesn't she look beautiful? Amen. Thank you, sister. Brothers and sisters, I just got finished watching this talent show, and really, it blew my mind. It shows you just how much talent, just how much goodness, just how much positiveness we have in our community. And that's what we've got to do. We got to accentuate the positive. So this winter, when you go back to school, I want to see those talent shows in those junior high schools, elementary schools, accentuating the positiveness of our young people. Do I hear you? Do I hear you?
Jitu moved the operation to the Armory in about 75, 76.
The 13th Regiment Armory, also known as the Sumner Armory, was built in 1894 by the state of New York, and it's the largest armory in Brooklyn. It's a huge 3/4 square block castle.
It seemed like a whole new world. It was like, wow, this is like really, really huge. And it was nothing to occupy that space because, again, we were busting at the seams on Claver Place with all of the stuff that we were doing.
We began to expand and allow other community organizations to come in. We had food. We had other schools we shared the facility with. We had after-school programs, night programs, dance classes, dance troupes practicing there. And so we had probably by 1981, we had over 3 dozen different programs in that facility. So it was a massive operation taking place. It was almost 24/7.
So the East in itself as an organization intentionally positioned itself in a space where we were not firmly rooted or attached to any particular ideology to the exclusion of others. Meaning that although people may have identified us as cultural nationalists, we had revolutionary nationalists that were not only part of it, but also sent their children to the schools and stuff. So it was intentionally, designed to be a space for everybody to come. So when we ended up moving to the Armory, it ended up being more of a gathering space. And so I do refer to it, for lack of a better example, as Switzerland of the liberation movement.
The East welcomed everybody that were of African descent, whatever religious or spiritual denomination anybody was from, even if you were just off the street, it was okay.
This was a Pan-African community. we brought all those people together. And there was no hierarchy. You know, you didn't have to be from this place or that place, because if you look at the leadership, you'll see Jitu was from Brooklyn, but Mensah, Panamanian, Adeyemi, Jamaican.
I never felt the compelling, reason to change my name. I never, it just never struck me. Although everybody basically around me had an African name. There were a few of us that did not. Joan never changed her name. Alberta never changed her name. So there were a few, and it was fine. I was always Sister Martha, Mama Martha.
In this complex organization, and as the organization began to grow, and as people began to come into the fold of the East, there had to be certain guidelines and rules established of any organization. So there was a brotherhood code, and there was a brotherhood meeting and congregation where the brothers would deal with other brothers based on matters of righteousness, conduct, and behavior. For the sister, there was a sisterhood, the East Sisterhood, and they too would also deal with concerns, issues, but also visions concerning the sisters in the organization. And both the brotherhood and sisterhood would come together in the East family meeting during the weekend. And so the 1960s was a time of experimentation. And that meant experimenting with a range of illicit drugs, experimenting with also a range of sexual as well as conjugal unions. And so polygamy was on the table. And in this mix, an era of experimentation, the East sought to think about voluntary polygamy or polygyny, the idea that not simply that a man could have more than one wife, but the idea of, well, how do we grow this community based on a family model? And so there was a voluntary option of those who wanted to join a polygamous relationship.
You know, from a child's perspective, I grew up with two mothers. And that was normal for me. For most of my life, I thought that was just normal. It wasn't until I left Uhuru Sasa, I went to public school, and looked around, I was like, how come nobody else got two moms? What's going on? When I say it was normal, though, it literally was something that benefited the children in that we had twice the love, we had twice the care, we had all of that. Now, what that did for the women directly, I can only imagine.
One day I walked in there and they announced that the Brotherhood had decided that all of the single women were going to be connected to a brother or a family. And it wasn't going to be up to the sister who that was going to be. So at that moment, I decided that it was time to go back to college. I didn't at that point really know how to stand up for myself and fight back to against sexism. So I just said, well, I guess that means I'm leaving the East because I wasn't going to stand for that. Of course, I found out a few months later that many sisters weren't going to stand for it and they stopped it. So I could have stayed, but I think it was my time anyway.
So there were challenges in terms of it being a male-dominated organization. But I think, to be fair, the East was sort of a replica of its time, right? So during that time, there were, women in the East that were very educated, who had completed, college, who came back to be within this organization. But they were just relegated to positions of, teaching, working at the daycare center, or the kitchen, which at that time, that's where women, that's where their duties were.
What I do know is that it impacted men by us standing on some false premises around patriarchy and sexism, believing that the work needed to be surrounding us. That's dangerous. Like, we ended up modeling something that's dangerous now. So much of my generation, we are now trying to reframe ourselves. Even some of the language in there, rise up, black man, take your stand, rise up, black woman, bring us some children. That was part of a song. So as an adult, I'm like, I can't believe I sung that shit. So I now switch that around, and when I teach my children that song, it's Rise Up Black Man, Take Your Stand. I think it was Rise Up Black Family. Let's something else. I forget what I switched it up, but it's not that anymore.
What was pretty male dominated in terms of the leadership, but I don't think it was exclusive to the men. There was some powerhouse dynamic sisters there at the East too. Sister Auntie Brown, I would watch her and see how she moved and, go about managing the school, the Uhuru Sasa in the very beginning stages. Then there's the sisters in the kitchen, Mama Lottie and Sister Isenga, Sister Khadija. These sisters were really making things happen.
This idea of Kazi wasn't exclusively just to the East. Many organizations, many people who were part of that movement, were about putting in the work, however and whenever they could. And oftentimes it was to the detriment of their own health. Many of them literally worked themselves into early graves. And we are absolutely, grateful for the institutions that were built. But we know now that there was other ways to do that.
People began to become burnt out. One of the classic cases is Jitu Weusi, one of the founders of the East. By 1977, he had relinquished directorship over the East organization and over Uhuru Sasa. By doing so, he was exhausted, he was burnt out, and he saw many of the, what he called opportunistic people who came to the East, who came to Uhuru Sasa, but didn't want to essentially endure the long distance fight.
Yeah, so the East ended for various reasons. One, leadership change. Jitu left, and then there were other administrators who came in afterwards who, people didn't like.
But there's also another aspect. A lot of the folks like myself had now grown up. Now, what I was doing at 19 and 20, I couldn't now be doing at 25 and 30 because I now had 5, 6 children. I now had rent to pay. Some cases a mortgage, a car note, all of these things began to put pressure on folks so that we did not have the same luxury of a committed cadre of young people, many of whom were doing what they did without a dime, without asking for a dime, because they were committed. There was the energy, it was the power. But when folks had families, things changed up a little bit.
Well, the East had its ups and downs because the struggle had its ups and downs. We had, of course, always was living from hand to mouth financially. And so we never had much of a cushion financially. It was just, a series of things that happened that didn't allow for us to recover. When we lost the Armory, we were already under attack. The powers that be, they have you under scrutiny 24/7. People had their COINTELPRO files, and we had our infiltrators through the years.
My father would tell me about people who came in, with all these ideas, wanting to do X, Y, and Z, pick up arms and do that. And some of them were just like really telltale signs of infiltrators. Like, no, you can leave now.
They were being surveilled by both New York City Police Department as well as federal agencies. In fact, Jitu Weusi has a thick dossier, thick file from the COINTELPRO era. You also had the mayorships of Mayor Ed Koch and the New York NYPD coming down hard in the East. And so a lot of these changes in leadership, a lot of these changes in personnel really led to a decline in the East. And so by 1985, 1986, the East could no longer sustain Uhuru Sasa, which again was the heartbeat of the organization, and it closed its doors in 1986.
What I think happened with the East is what happens to a lot of Black organizations. One, you have to understand that these are experiments, right? In many instances, the East was doing things that very few organizations had ever done before.
We will dog what ain't working. We will let everybody and their mama know that it's broke. But when we are doing those things, we're not putting enough emphasis and lifting up and praising. My email thing says, find the good and praise it. Dr. Betty Shabazz always told me that. She said, find the good and praise it.
And so, was it able to, bring us to the promised land? No, of course not. Did it take us a few steps towards that and our liberation? Hell yes. And I think that the East will always be recognized for that.
So the legacy of the East, we recognize is many. There's different ways that we continue as the East family. We have lost a brick and mortar building. The Armory is no longer under our control. 10 Claver Place is now like an apartment building. But there are other real, tangible kinds of manifestations of our legacy that still exist. One, of course, is the International African Arts Festival. 2021 is the 50th anniversary of the festival.
And me, I'm part of the East legacy. And there's so many people like me who are out there doing the work. We're grassroots people, we're community-based people, but we are bringing our wisdom, our experience, and our perspective to, our community.
We're still all making moves, opening stores, opening businesses, starting our own businesses.
I would say that the East influenced me 100% to become a teacher. I did not have that as a goal, and I didn't really admire or look up to teachers because I had some of the worst teachers in the world. I had no model until I met Brother Jitu and so many other people. People who were dedicated teachers and who understood that the impact that a teacher can have is lifelong and can make a huge difference. And I said, okay, I'm gonna start a school for people like me and for my child. And I'm gonna have Black dolls, I'm gonna have Black storybooks. I had to create those books, by the way, because there weren't any at the time. So I started my own program, essentially for my child. And then I invited my friends that I had connected with at the East who were all becoming parents. So come on over here and let's do this thing together. Little Sun People. We started in 1981 and we're still here today.
Oh, wow. Being in the East had a huge, tremendous impact on me being an artist, on me being a proud Black African woman, being a Brooklynite, being a sister. Being in the East just made me feel like I could do anything. Well, I created the Dwana Smallwood Performing Arts Center about 7 years ago, and it was literally spoken to me. I felt like I needed to do it. It was something that I felt like I owed my community. We have a transformative travel program where we took some girls to South Africa. I lived there a couple of years, creating the dance program at the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy. I get into Ailey and travel the world, and so it's just like, my life has been a dream, but actually, I saw the whole thing by the time I was 5. And the East basically sprinkled some salt, some paprika, some adobo, some cayenne pepper, and was like, go get it.
I'm an organizer. I'm an organizer with the Malcolm X grassroots movement, and I have been organizing all my life. And I'm an organizer because of the East. I'm an organizer because of the pledges I took every day as a child at Uhuru Sasa Shule. What was made clear to me was I had to, on a regular basis, figure out what my contribution to the liberation of my people was going to be, what I wanted to see change, how I was going to do it, and be about the business of making that happen. And so through organizing, that was some of the ways that I did that and continue to do that. There's no question that that would not be the case had I not been raised in the East.
When we look at the African Street Festival, for instance, we look at Little Sun People, these are some of the more celebrated institutions. But there are businesses and enterprises and activities throughout this neighborhood, and really throughout this world, that were inspired, were given refuge, were given a home, were given a spark by the East.
So the changes in Bed-Stuy now, it's sad. It's sad. Some of it, probably could have been prevented, but we know it's intentional. We do know, this idea of gentrification, of displacement is by design. It's not, coincidental. But what's interesting is that the Bed-Stuy that people are chasing, that people came here for, what they maybe don't realize is as the more of them come, what they're chasing is getting driven further away. We built a very historic kind of community here for decades, and to see it being dismantled, to seeing people being displaced and driven away is sad in some cases, infuriating in others, reflective most times. But there's signs that maybe it actually can be stopped. Again, I think that some of the other parts of the legacy of the East are the boom of Black businesses. I'm calling it a boom of being aspirational. There's a lot of Black businesses that have closed down in Bed-Stuy, but there's some new ones that have opened up, and many of them have a function that is very much reminiscent of the East.
The East isn't going anywhere because the children of the East are keeping it alive, and we are going to teach our children, and you can see it.